Welcome to Second Table, where we discuss spirituality, philosophy, and psychology. I'm your host, Winston Janis. Welcome back, everyone, to the Second Table podcast. Today, I'm so excited to be with Thomas Jay Oord, who is a theologian, philosopher, and scholar of multidisciplinary studies. He's a best-selling and award-winning author, having written more than 25 books. He is a professor at Northwind Theological Seminary and directs doctoral students in open and relational theology. He is actually the director of the Center for Open and Relational Theology. Thomas's most recent book, which I read and I'm excited to talk to him about today, is entitled God Can't: How to Believe in God and Love After Tragedy, Abuse, and Evil. Thanks so much for being with me today, Thomas. Glad to have you here.
Hey, it's my pleasure to have this conversation.
Yeah. So I have always been deeply interested in, it's the type of person I am, I guess. I mean, most people, this is a huge question for them, but I'm deeply interested in the problem of theodicy, right? The problem of pain, the problem of suffering. Why does suffering exist? I think on that level of trying to make sense of reality and life, and I think that for so many people, right, that's why your book is so important. I think it's great that you're doing this kind of work of helping people to make sense of life as so much is changing in the way that we're trying to understand the world and our faith and everything that's happening, especially in the midst of the coronavirus, right? I think this question is on a lot of, it's a timeless question. It's always been on a lot of people's minds, but it's, I think, hitting us in a fresh way with the current, circumstances and in the contemporary world. So I was happy to read your book and would love to talk a little more about it, and have a couple questions for you. Maybe our listeners can relate to some of those questions, to elaborate on some things, to go deeper with a few things. If I'm understanding the book correctly, and hopefully I am, but you're just giving an overview, and in the book God Can't, you're arguing that God, we are in the Christian understanding, God is love, is equated in some sense with love, and that a God who is love, that you're saying that the nature of love is inherently uncontrolling, and so because it's uncontrolling, it's not in its nature to force and coerce and make these decisions and stop, and that actually love cannot stop some of the major causes of pain and suffering in our existence, in reality, in our day-to-day lives. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I begin with the view that God is a loving God. I get that idea from Scripture, even though there are some passages that portray God as unloving. I think the majority of Scriptures point to a God of perfect or steadfast love. And I think the revelation of God that we find in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is our clearest picture that God is a God of love. And like you and like most people, I look at the world, I look at my own life, and I see genuine evils there, pointless pain, unnecessary suffering, and I wonder, well, if God's a loving God, then why doesn't God stop this, prevent these evils? Some people say, well, God doesn't cause the evil in your life, or God doesn't cause this coronavirus, God doesn't cause the Holocaust, and they think that somehow gets God off the hook. But if God has the kind of power most believers, most Christians, and even Muslims and Jews, but especially Muslims and Christians, if God has the kind of omnipotent power they think God has, you would wonder why God doesn't prevent the evils of the world, not just cause them, but prevent them. And my solution is to say that God just doesn't have the kind of omnipotent power that most Christians have thought God has. And I don't think Scripture supports that particular view, and my argument is that just the common sense way we live in the world suggests that God's a God of uncontrolling love.
So, are you saying that you feel like Scripture supports the view that you're presenting?
Yeah, I am saying that. It's a pretty bold move, huh? I mean, a lot of people read the Bible and they'll see things happening and they just sort of presuppose that God is causing things, or at least allowing things, as if God could stop them if God wanted to. But I actually think there is let me repeat, no explicit biblical evidence that says God ever controls anyone or anything, from the beginning of creation, through the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, through the resurrection of Jesus, through the eschatological fulfillment. I think God always acts in love, and that love is always uncontrolling.
That is pretty bold. So I have a couple questions for you. There's really just only a couple questions that really feel like they're at the forefront of my mind. But as we're talking about, it doesn't have to be in any particular order, I suppose, but as we're talking about the power of God, I wonder, in what sense might God be powerful, right? Because when I think of God, I think of the source and origin of the universe as we know it. So where does the creative power of God come in? If God can't prevent evil or control things, how do we hang on to that idea in some sense of God as the source of the universe, the God that brings us into being, that brings the galaxies and the stars into being? How do we reconcile those things? God being the source and origin of the universe, and yet not being able to prevent evil.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of people have, when they think of God as creator, just assume that creating means bringing something from absolutely nothing. But we know that in our everyday lives, we create things, animals create things, and it's never from absolutely nothing. It might be surprising, the things that emerge, but it's never creatio ex nihilo, creation from absolute nothingness. But many people have been thinking that God has this kind of power, and even though the Bible doesn't say God creates something out of nothing, they just assume that God's creating involves this. I think we can believe that God is the creative source of our universe in the past and moment by moment in the present, but also think that God's creating is through uncontrolling love. My view says that God creates in every moment out of that which God previously created. And even though our universe began with a Big Bang roughly 13.8 billion years ago, God was creating before that out of that which God previously created. In fact, I think my view has an advantage of saying that God's very nature is creative love. Most other theologians think that there was a time that God wasn't creating and that God wasn't relating with creaturely others. My view says God is always creating and relating and loving others everlastingly. I don't get into that much in God Can't, so if you didn't notice it there, I've got it in some other writings. But that particular view, I think, overcomes, a legitimate worry you might have or others might have, which says that, well, look, if God created the world out of nothing, God must have the power to single-handedly do whatever God wants to do. And so I don't think we have to believe God single-handedly created the world out of absolute nothingness.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense that makes one of the things that's I guess somewhat distinctive about me is that I've been very influenced by Eastern religious traditions, particularly Buddhism, and so I that in some sense that is, and in combination with the doctrine of the incarnation, has influenced me in thinking that the universe as we know it is this expression of God, that the incarnation goes beyond just the person of Jesus.
Good.
And so I guess in some ways maybe I'm trying, as I'm making sense of it in my head, that right, that maybe in some sense God isn't completely distinct from creation, so that God is always, like you said, from the beginning, from before creation, God is somehow involved with creation as God's expression, or God's own incarnation and body is the universe, is the reality that we experience.
Yeah, I think my way of putting it would still want to make a distinction between God and the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not a pantheist, for instance, but I like panentheism,
Right.
or my own little word is theocosmocentrism. But these words are ways to try to talk about how God is interrelated with creation. God's not the same as the world, but I believe God is very much affected by everything that happens in the entire universe and affects everything that happens in the entire universe. But what makes my view a little different from most is that I think this has everlastingly been the case. There never was a time in which God was just sitting all alone and thinking, ain't doing much today. I think maybe I'll create something.
Mm-hmm.
Nope. God's always been creating everlastingly.
So maybe one question that comes out of this, a next logical question would be, what then, if God's role is not to prevent evil and is not to create something out of nothing, then what is God's role in the universe?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, if we take off the table the idea that God can control us and create out of nothing, then you have still on the table the idea that God always acts in influential love. So just like good parents who influence their kids toward good things, they're neither abandoning them off twiddling their thumbs all the time away from them, nor are they manipulating, controlling them, but they're always acting to lure, persuade, call, even command them to do what is right and good, but never in a controlling way. So I think those analogies we find, especially in the Christian scriptures, but in other religious traditions, that paint God as a loving parent can be really helpful to overcome both the controlling views that sometimes slip in our theology, but also the kind of deistic, God away on vacation kind of views.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it also, it makes me think of, I guess my other question, right? My other sort of burning question that's in my mind and has been for a while, right, that I wrestle with a lot is, okay, so parents, I guess love takes different expressions. I agree
Sure.
with you that in a sense there's this connection with love and freedom, that like a good parent is not going to determine, hey, this is exactly how my kids are going to turn out, and this is what I'm going to command them to do, and there's no wiggle room at all. There's a freedom there of letting the children be and express and grow into who they are authentically. And yet, there are certain structures and parameters, right? There's a structure to it that's there are times when you just hold boundaries with your kids, right? I have 3 young kids, so I think about this, but I'm just thinking about, for example, one parallel maybe is one way to think about it is the laws of nature, right? There are certain parameters in reality, gravity, etc., right? The laws of physics. And I'm thinking about evolution and In a way, I guess, one answer that Christians have given for why human evil exists is free will. That God gives free will, and so, hopefully we can work towards becoming better people and not engaging in evil activities, right? But when you look at it at the animal world, in the natural world, you see that, right, a lion cannot survive without killing. It seems, right, that the lion has evolved to kill, and that is built into reality. That's built into nature itself. And so I wonder, okay, what does this say about the nature of God that we see in reality? That so many species of animals cannot survive without killing others. That's one way in which I think about the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. That it seems like it's just there, built into the experience of life.
Yeah, I see two major questions in what you said, and let me address the evolution one first. Notice that, in my view, since God doesn't start with a blank slate, the question of why God might create a system in which there's an evolutionary process that necessarily brings about violence and harm doesn't arise in the same kind of way, because I can say that God couldn't set up a system that didn't involve some kind of evolutionary struggle and tension. So it paints God as creator in a very different way. Maybe to put it differently, your kind of question presupposes that God set things up in the world the way they are. But I'm undermining or asking us to rethink that as well. Yes, I think God is a necessary actor, cause in all of creation and has been everlastingly. But God never sort of sat back and said, so in this world, should I give free will or make everybody robots? Nope. It's God's very nature to create uncontrollable creatures, because God's always creating in relation to that which God can't control. So it's a different way of thinking, and it, I think, addresses your fine question that arises in the minds of many people when they think about the questions of what we sometimes call natural evil. The other part of your statement that I want to kind of riff on a bit is taking this parent analogy. All analogies when it comes to God have some sort of limits. I think the idea that God is a loving his or her kids, or also is never absent, is a good one. But one of the differences between you as a parent with your 3 kids, and I happen to have 3 kids too, me as a parent with my 3 kids, is that we have a power, a capacity, probably is a better way to put it, a capacity that God doesn't have. And I didn't realize this until I began thinking about the problem of evil. I was presenting, maybe 15 years ago, I was presenting some of these ideas at a philosophy conference, and a guy stood up in the back row and raised his hands, and he said, if I'm at home and my kid starts to walk toward the stove and is going to put his hand on a hot stove, and let's say I reach over and grab his hand just before it hits the stove and thwart his free will choices, isn't that a loving thing to do? I mean, isn't that a loving parent who sometimes steps in and grabs the kid's hand before he burns himself or herself?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, it is a good point. And I realized I had to think about this. And I discovered that the Christian tradition itself, and Judaism actually, I suppose this is true of Islam, but I'm not as familiar with Muslim theology, but the Christian tradition itself had already worked on this, not in relation to the problem of evil, but just in relation to epistemology. How do we know God is in the world? And they have said that God is incorporeal, which means God is bodiless. God is a universal spirit. One of my favorite theologians, a guy named John Wesley, says God's the soul of the universe. So as this universal spirit who doesn't have a localized body, God can't reach out and grab the arms of 3-year-olds before they hit a hot stove. But you and I, sometimes, if we're in the right place in the right time, can reach out. Now, it doesn't mean we're controlling our kids, because they still have some freedom and agency, etc. But it means in that moment, we're using our bodies to thwart at least some of their intended bodily actions. And so being a good parent does sometimes mean using our body to exert bodily impact upon others. But God doesn't have a localized body like we do. Now, I say that there are some Christians who believe this. Our Mormon brothers and sisters, Latter-day Saints, they think God has an actual body. But the vast majority of Christians have said, nope, God doesn't have that kind of body. Even the incarnation of Jesus is not an instance in which God's essence is bodied in some way. And here we get into all kinds of interesting Christological questions. But Jesus himself doesn't exhibit all of the attributes we want to think God has. He's not omnipresent, for instance. He's not omnipotent, if that's one of your attributes, etc. So even I think we can say with the incarnation of Jesus, Jesus's body isn't literally divine in that sense.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel as though, going back, I mean, I think I would describe myself probably as a panentheist.
Okay.
I don't know if you would, but yeah, and I think so. It's interesting as I'm considering these ideas. I do think it's an interesting point to consider what you mentioned. You're right. I think you're right that I have been making an assumption that this system has been set up sort of beforehand, right, by God. So it's really interesting to consider that perhaps this has been somehow a cooperative endeavor from the beginning.
It's a radical new idea. I mean, I think 99% of Christians throughout the centuries have thought, maybe 99's a little high. The early church, a lot of the early church leaders rejected creation out of nothing. But it was Tertullian in about the 3rd or 4th century who sort of solidified the doctrine. It emerged actually from some Gnostics. A couple of Gnostics were not wanting a God who would mess around with, what they considered the evil matter of creation. And so they invented the idea, apparently, of God creating out of nothing. But a lot of Christian theologians picked it up because it supported this view of divine omnipotence that they really liked. And so a lot of people today sort of assume that God, maybe they think that God created out of nothing initially, but no longer controls or no longer creates out of nothing. I think that's a pretty common view. But most people think that God started with a blank slate, and I'm rejecting that.
Okay, well, here's another question that maybe arises out of that, right? Because, okay,
Good.
why did I presuppose that, God sort of put the rules in place, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's a comforting thought, because if God puts the rules and the parameters in place, that means that in some sense, one way to put it is that there's a plan, right? That as we move through life and through the whole experience, that at the end of this, there's going to be something good, and that it's going to be okay. And one of my concerns that comes up, right, is if this is an open-ended thing that is constantly evolving, and that maybe even God doesn't know the outcome or what the plan is, so to speak, how can there be a guarantee that things are going to turn out okay, right? Does that make sense?
That's a great question. Great question. Yeah. Let me begin answering that good question by saying the idea that this is God's plan is an idea that torments lots of people who are victims. Whether they're victims of individual kind of suffering, like, torture or abuse, sexual molesting or whatever, or if they're the victims of more social structures, if they're, they're in the bottom low percent in terms of the wealth and well-being of the world. For some people, not all of them, but for some people who are survivors and victims, to think that what they're going through or what the world is like is God's plan doesn't make them want to believe in a loving God. But for some of them, thinking that the world we currently live in isn't God's plan, but God ultimately has a good plan, and everything is going to work out all right in the end, that gives them a little hope.
Right.
And now, not everybody is in that group, because some people see that if God can't fix things in the present, then, or at least if God doesn't fix things in the present and could, then why think that God's going to be so great at the end? But let's just set that important question aside for a second. How can we have any, I'll use the more theological word, how can I have any hope that things will be better, in fact, maybe even perfect someday? That's usually, called eschatology, sort of in things.
Right.
The traditional view has said that in some way, shape, or form, God's going to guarantee some fulfillment at the end. Either God's going to send some people to hell for all eternity and other people to heaven, or God's going to send everybody to heaven, some sort of universalism, or God's going to fry off and burn out and annihilate the bad guys and let the good guys come home. Whatever I'm just making sort of caricatures here. But, those are kind of the options most people have on the table. But the God I believe in doesn't have the kind of controlling power to single-handedly bring into effect any one of those three options. Not only can't this God wouldn't send anybody to hell for in eternity, but this God also couldn't force everybody into a heaven, because God doesn't have that kind of power. I do think, though, this view presents, I think, a more plausible overall eschatology. I call it the relentless love view. It says that, nope, God can't guarantee through force, through omnipotent power, that either everybody goes to heaven or, separates the sheep and goats to hell and heaven, whatever. But God never gives up in this life and the next. God always seeks loving relationship. That means that what we do really matters right here and later. Our choices have we might say, an eternal impact, not only the choices we make now, but the choices we make in the afterlife. In my view, there's the genuine hope that God will eventually persuade all creation to a loving relationship. It doesn't have the guarantee that can only comes through controlling power, but there's the real hope, because God never gives up. And so, all things considered, I find this view of God's purpose, this view of this eschatological hope, more satisfying.
Wow. Well, gosh, in some ways it's like, talk about a theology of suspense and, responsibility, right? It seems like it puts a lot of responsibility on us, the creatures, the created, the creation.
It sure does. Yeah. I mean, just think about the usual views of God's power. There's a small set of people who think that God controls absolutely everything. We'll just, for the sake of identification, we'll call them hardcore Calvinists. They think there's no freedom, no chance, God does the whole bit. Well, obviously in that framework, our choices, our lives, our decisions, they don't really matter, because God determines everything. But more people are in the second camp. And that camp says, God invites us to be a part of what God's up to in the world. God gives us free will, maybe, or God is calling us to be a part of the work of the kingdom, or whatever. You've probably heard the language and used it yourself. Mm-hmm. But usually those in that second position have in the back of their mind that God could single-handedly just get the job done without us. It's kind of, I call this the condescending God. The condescending God says, hey, come help me out here. But if we don't help him out, well, God's just going to do it anyway. And the result of that view, and the first one, is that ultimately our lives don't matter. We're not truly significant. Our choices really don't make a real difference. The theology I'm proposing says your choices make a difference, not only for yourself, but they have effect on others. We live in an interrelated universe. And so that's real responsibility. Now, it doesn't mean that my choices determine all of the world. I mean, the whole world isn't on my shoulders, but I do have real choices given the limited options in every moment, and God can't control me.
Gosh, wow. Well, I mean, a lot of that makes a lot of sense, and I would say, because what is the question that's really at the core for me, right? Is because we're all, most of us, especially in today's world, we're walking through life, and we have a lot of anxiety because I think the central kind of deep down question that we have, I think, as Einstein is supposed to have said, do we live in a universe that is friendly, that is safe? And because it's scary to walk through this world and feel like, well, anything can anything bad, something terrible might happen to you today, tonight, whatever, and I think that affects how we think about and relate to God. So I think you're proposing a lot of interesting ideas to rethink these things. But I guess, yeah, I'm just still wondering. It sounds like it's an open-ended, collaborative thing that, in some sense, I guess I'm just wondering, in what here's another way maybe to put the question, right? It's like, there's a lot of questions in there, I suppose, but how might we feel the comfort or presence or support of God when we're living in this open-ended universe, relational universe, in which anything can happen? You can get cancer, you can get abused, violence can be done to you. It's a very scary thing, and I think a lot of what you're saying makes sense, that we live in a world in which we have a part in creating, that we have to take responsibility for that world, that in some sense, it's almost like our identity is caught up with the identity of God. And that's something that that makes sense to me, and I think I can believe in. But I think what I'm looking for, and I think many people are looking for, is how do we feel that sense of support and comfort from God to be able to affirm life and to get through this experience of life, and to believe that it's beautiful and it's worth living, and no matter come what may, right?
Right. Well, I think part of the answer is that the life we live does have beauty in it. It does have moments of deep love. It does have great goodness. But it also has horrific tragedy. It has unimaginable suffering. And so if you're someone who's looking for some kind of theology that gives you a lot of safety, you're either going to have to look at all that suffering and say, well, it's not real. It's just part of God's mysterious good plan, and we just don't understand it. But most people I know who are victims of evil, they want to give the middle finger to that view, because what they're thinking is, look, this ain't safe right now. If this is what safe is supposed to be, if this is a God who's loving and safe, well, then I want nothing to do with that God. So the view I'm presenting on the table provides a kind of reassurance of God's steadfast love, moment by moment. We'll always know that God loves us and all creation, and that God is truly acting for the good, but we never have the guarantee that good will win, because God's love is uncontrolling. It requires our response and creation's response. And so what I like to say is that maybe this theology doesn't provide the kind of reassuring safety that controlling kind of theology provides. But boy, it sure seems to fit well with the way the world actually works. Like it makes, you've already said, it makes sense. A lot of people, when I present these ideas in a public forum, always someone will come up to me afterwards and they'll say, you know, I've always kind of believed what you've just said, but I've never had the words to articulate it because what you say just makes sense of the way life seems to work. And I think that's an important test for any theology. Does it actually apply to the world in which we live, but also give hope that things can be better?
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, I don't know. I just think about how it fits with the things that I've been exposed to up until now. Theology that I mean, in a way, I guess one question I'm still wrestling too with, you know, in what way is God distinct from ourselves, right? Because if we are such an important and crucial part of this creation that influences the outcome and influences everything that happens in a way, you know, like I said, I've been influenced by a lot of Eastern traditions, and I think you can find evidence of this in the Christian tradition as well, that in some sense it's like we are in almost like some aspect of God or some connected to God in this really intimate way in which you could almost say, some people would say, you're identified with God. You know, like I am the vine, you are the branches.
We are the body of Christ.
We are the body of Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. There's this connection that's so intimate that it almost the identity is one and the same. And I almost wonder if this fits with that a little bit. I like having the theology in which God is somehow distinct, because I think that God has to be beyond our individual egos, right? That God must somehow be larger than ourselves as individuals, and yet you have this. You know, I think you actually quoted it maybe towards the end of the book, the prayer of Teresa of Avila, right? Christ now has no body but ours, no hands, no feet but ours, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for me, for a number of reasons, to make a distinction between God and me, God and the world. One of the biggest ones is that I think God always loves. And I know that I don't. And I know that other people in the world don't. In other words, if I want to think God is a God of moral perfection, I just can't think God and the world are the same. Otherwise, I have to look at every torture and rape as somehow morally perfect, and I just can't do that. On the other hand, there is this deep identification that you mentioned. And the way that I've come to embrace that, if you don't mind me getting a little nerdy and technical for a second here, I'm in the camp of theologians who think that God is passible or affected by the world. And this being affected by the world is true because God is experiential. In other words, unlike some theologians who think God is an unmoved mover, a substance that sometimes bumps into other substances, I think God is an experiential individual in whose experience we really make a difference, but also in our experience really makes a difference. So we can really be in God in the sense of being in God's experience, and God can be in us in the sense of being in our experience as a causal force. That doesn't mean we're the same, it doesn't make us identical, but I think it captures some of the deep truths that you've mentioned about this strong relational connection between God and creation.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, I think that we have that intuition. We see it recurrently throughout our tradition, and I think there's a lot of truth in that.
Yeah.
I guess one other thing, like I said, I'd be curious to hear maybe your thoughts of whether. So, as I mentioned, I've been influenced by different Eastern traditions, and I'm interested in like the thought of Alan Watts, and there's this perspective. Like Thich Nhat Hanh is another Buddhist teacher, and he'll say, for example, he has a book by the title "No Mud, No Lotus," right? And it's all about the book. The subtitle of the book is "The Art of Transforming Suffering," and so the way that a lot of Buddhist thinkers have made sense of suffering is that there's a degree to which you could say you cannot know what it's like to have a good day unless you've had a bad day. That the idea of contrast is so central to just the way that our brains are wired. I listened to a TED Talk. Can't remember the name of the guy off the top of my head, but he was like a sociologist, I believe, and he said that the name of the TED Talk was "Why We Need Pain to Feel Happiness," and he talked about all these different experiences that people have, and there were so many elements to the talk, but talking about how when we have difficult experiences like running a marathon or graduating from college, that these experiences have meaning and bring us happiness because they were difficult, because they were challenging. And so that in a way that in order for us to experience happiness and love and joy and all these things and pleasure, there needs to be experience that contrasts those experiences of pain, namely pain and suffering and the absence of all that. So that being an idea that we have explored a little bit to some extent in past episodes on this podcast, right? I'm curious how this fits or doesn't fit, maybe, or exploring that a little bit with you, with the theology that you're proposing.
Yeah, I'm going to try to keep my responses concise because I could go forever on this one. In one sense, there's a really profound fit with what I'm suggesting, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm trying to take what seems to be the reality of the world in which we live, which includes both pain and joy, right. Suffering as well as happiness. So,
right. Not to interrupt, but like I saw you sent and you were talking about this on the Methods podcast, right? About I know you do photography work, and you were talking about your attraction to the contrasts in the photograph and how that mirrors theology. So, right, that's part of the reason I wanted to ask you this question too. But
good.
Continue.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. Where I differ from a lot of Christians is that I don't think God causes or allows the pain in order for us to know about the contrast or teach us a lesson or build our character or something like that. So kind of a very common view is that God could have prevented the bad thing that happened, but God is going to somehow allow it in order to bring about something better, a greater good kind of view. I don't buy into that, but what I do buy into is the view that God never gives up on any situation and works to squeeze some good out of the bad God didn't want in the first place. So this means, again, kind of going back to the God didn't set everything up. It means that there is the capacity for joy and happiness as well as suffering and pain in creation. God knows this. God didn't insert it. God knows this is the case. God calls us and all creation toward what's truly good, overall well-being. But when we choose otherwise, or the conditions of creation aren't conducive for well-being, or they're just a bad luck, a bad accident, God continues to work with whatever occurs to try to, in the next moment, call, lure, persuade, work toward what's the best then. So the learning that we sometimes do from from pain. Even sometimes positive things that come from negative things aren't somehow God ordained, but they are God working to squeeze something good out of them. Let me just, you at the top of the show, you talked about the coronavirus. Bunch of people have died because of this. Other people really hurt. Folks have lost jobs. There's been a lot of suffering because of this coronavirus. But there's also been a lot of really cool stuff that's come from it. People started writing books. They've done some, they've helped one another. There's all kinds of really good stuff. Now, one way to look at this is you might say, well, God allowed the coronavirus to kill hundreds of thousands of people because God really knew that some of us needed to have something better. Well, it's hard for me to look at the victims of coronavirus and say, I'm sorry, but, your cousin's death was just for the good of the rest of us. That don't make any sense to me. But I can say God's trying to squeeze whatever good can be squeezed from the crap, the coronavirus God didn't want in the first place.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, but I'm just still a little bit. If you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on how you feel like there's this. How does that match with, the idea that perhaps you cannot know pleasure without pain, like we were talking about that concept a little bit. I'm not sure if I feel fully clear on that, if that makes sense.
It may be the case. No, I don't even want to go there. I think you can know pleasure without knowing pain. I know pleasure, but there's lots of pains I've never experienced. So there is an importance for contrast. So it could be the case I wouldn't know how good things are if I also hadn't had some bad experiences. So in that sense, maybe that's sort of built into reality. But what I'm rejecting is the idea that God is the one who built it in, or God has the kind of power to somehow intervene and stop it every once in a while. I'm just saying, given maybe it is the case that reality is such that there's always going to be some kind of contrast between pain and suffering. It's only a matter of degree. But I don't want to blame God for that. And I also want to claim that God's love compels God to try to wring whatever good can be wrung from the wrong. Boy, that's a nice alliteration there. Wring whatever good can be wrung from the wrong God didn't want.
Yeah. I think it's a view that is helpful and needed, especially like you said. There's so much theology out there and so many ways of understanding God that I think well-meaning people have presented, but that when we don't consider the implications of those views, which is what we're doing here, we're just exploring the implications of these views. None of us is going to maybe have the completely correct perspective, perhaps, or full understanding of divine reality, but there's so many ways in which people give answers, especially it seems within the Christian tradition, but I'm sure other traditions as well. And these answers are not necessarily adequate or helpful, and they might, to some people, be helpful or meaningful, but then we see, oh man, this is really can be harmful psychologically to a lot of others. And so it's great that you're opening up that conversation to think about God and think about the problem of pain and suffering in different ways that maybe fit reality better, as you said.
Yeah. Well, thanks for mentioning that. I mean, I've been criticizing some theologies here in this interview. I don't want to come across as having everything figured out. I also am not questioning the motives of people who say things like, God has a reason for that or whatever. I mean, I think a lot of people have positive motives who say things that I don't think make a lot of sense. Sometimes people have positive motives for saying things that really hurt people. So it's not a matter of motives. It's not a matter of me thinking I'm smarter than everybody else and I've got all the answers. It is a matter, however, of me putting on the table a particular model of God, a particular theology, and then saying to everyone else, okay, here's what seems to me a pretty coherent view of reality that matches Scripture pretty well, actually. It matches our lives really well. This is the best model I've got. Now, if you think you've got a better one, let's compare models. If I agree, I'll switch to your model. Mm-hmm. But right now, of all the models I know, and I've studied a lot of them, this one makes the best overall sense.
Yeah. And that's the best any of us can do at the end, right? But yeah, well, I think it's important to have voices like yours, people who are really thinking deeply about these things, because I think maybe you mentioned at some point in your book that one of the number one reasons why people sort of adopt atheism is because of the sense of problem of suffering and pain in the universe, and how could there be a God if all this stuff is happening to people? So
I mean, polls say that that's the case, and anecdotally, I think it's number one question people who do believe in God ask. So this is not some sort of secondary or even tertiary issue. This is a question at the heart of the experience most people have of the universe.
Right. Yeah. It's been one of the central questions in my mind, and we want to live. We want to live a spiritually authentic life, and kind of retain the values that religion and our traditions and our heritages have for us. And for us to be able to do that, I think we need to be able to come to terms with or have some sense of peace about some of these larger questions that we have.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Maybe that's a good place to kind of wind down our conversation. I think it's been really fascinating and interesting to talk with you. Is there anything that you'd like to let our listeners know, where they can find you online, or projects you're working on, or anything at all you'd like to mention?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. We've been talking about this book, God Can't, which is a book that was really written for a wide public audience. A previous book I wrote called The Uncontrolling Love of God is a more academic version of this. It doesn't say everything that's in God Can't, but the main idea that God can't control is explained in a more, just say academic kind of way.
Nerdy.
Nerdy, there you go. I also recently accepted a position to direct doctoral students in an online startup seminary, students who want to study the implications of some of the ideas I've been talking about, but the ideas that fall under this general umbrella of open and relational theology. So that's been a lot of fun as I begin to work with folks wanting to get their doctoral degree and being able to work online with me one-on-one. It's been fun.
That sounds really great, Thomas. Congratulations on that. And I'm glad. I hope our listeners will, take notice of that. Thank you for being with us here on the Second Table podcast, and really enjoyed our conversation and appreciate your time to elaborate and answer questions about your book. I really enjoyed reading it, and hopefully we'll be hearing from you more in the future.
Thanks. I enjoyed this conversation.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening.